Hi everyone. I am Lindsay, 21F, and I need some suggestions. So, let's rewind a bit to where it all started. My parents, Mom, Marge, 46F, and Dad, Sebastian, 48M, were like the typical 80s couple. He was the laid-back guy who loved his music and she was the go-getter who worked hard and wanted everything done yesterday. They met in college, fell in love, and before long, they had me. I was their first kid, and as far back as I can remember, there was always this kind of simmering tension between them. Dad was the kind of guy who had big dreams and aspirations but was also prone to bouts of anxiety and depression. He was always a bit of a daydreamer, and while that's great in theory, it often left him feeling overwhelmed when things didn't go according to plan. He'd get these intense episodes where everything felt like it was closing in on him, and he'd just shut down. It was like watching someone drown in slow motion, and as a kid, I didn't really understand what was happening. Mom, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of energy. She was ambitious, driven, and had this almost unrelenting need for control. She was a natural organizer and wanted everything to be perfect, and that included our family life. Her patience for Dad's struggles was, let's say, pretty limited. Instead of offering support, she'd often make snide comments about how Dad was lazy or unmotivated, which obviously didn't help his mental health at all. I remember one time she said in front of me, "You know, if he spent as much time actually doing something as he does worrying about it, we'd probably have a yacht by now." It was awkward because I could see how much Dad was trying to keep it together. He'd put on this brave face, but you could tell he was hurting. And Mom's remarks, though maybe not meant to be cruel, felt like she was just pushing him further down. I guess, in her defense, she had her own pressures and expectations, and she didn't know how to deal with Dad's issues in a constructive way. As a kid, I always felt like I was walking on eggshells around Mom. She had this critical streak that made me second guess myself all the time. I'd bring home a report card with mostly as in a single B, and she'd zero in on the B, saying things like, "Well, you could have done better if you actually tried." It wasn't that she didn't care, she did. But her way of showing it was often through criticism rather than encouragement. I think she thought she was motivating me, but it just ended up making me feel inadequate. So growing up, I got this mixed message from both parents. Dad was this loving guy who could be incredibly supportive, but when he was down, he was really down. And Mom was always there pushing me to do better but never quite satisfied. It felt like no matter how hard I tried, I could never quite meet her expectations. The tension at home grew over the years, and the cracks in their relationship became more visible. Dad's mental health issues were always there, but they seemed to worsen as time went on. Mom's frustration with him only added to his stress, and it seemed like a vicious cycle. She would have these outbursts, and Dad would retreat further into his shell. Their arguments would get pretty intense, and I'd often find myself caught in the middle, trying to mediate or just stay out of the way. Eventually, things came to a head. I was about 14 when they finally decided to separate. I remember the day clearly. There was this huge fight that started with something small like who was supposed to take out the trash, and it escalated into a full-blown screaming match. The house was tense, and I could feel the energy shift. After that, Mom sat me down and told me that they were getting a divorce. It was surreal. I'd heard them argue before, but hearing that they were separating felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Mom's reasons were always about Dad's inability to cope with life and how his mental health issues were just too much for her to handle. Dad was devastated. He tried to put on a brave face, but it was clear how much it was hurting him. I tried to stay neutral, but I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and sadness. I was angry at Mom for her harshness and at Dad for not being able to fix things. But mostly, I felt lost. The separation wasn't easy. Mom moved out and found a new place, and Dad stayed in the house, which was both familiar and strangely empty without her. We did the whole back and forth thing for a while, which was emotionally draining. I'd spend weekends with Mom, and the rest of the time with Dad. It felt like my world was split in two, and neither side felt like home anymore. Then, a few months after their separation, something happened that turned everything upside down. Dad committed suicide. It was a shock, to say the least. I don't know if you can ever really prepare for something like that. One minute, you're trying to navigate a new normal, and the next, you're hit with the devastating news that someone you love is gone forever. It was a dark time. Dad's passing left a gaping hole in my life, and I was struggling to come to terms with it. I remember feeling a mix of anger and confusion, anger at him for leaving us and confusion over how to deal with this overwhelming grief. Mom was obviously devastated too, but her way of coping was to try and maintain a semblance of normalcy. She threw herself into work and her social life, trying to keep busy to avoid dealing with the pain. Then, as if things weren't complicated enough, Mom started seeing someone new. It was a few months after Dad's death when she introduced her new boyfriend to me. At first, I was hopeful that this new relationship might bring some stability into her life. Maybe she'd find happiness again and it would help us all move forward. However, she soon broke up with him. A few years ago, she started dating someone new. Mom was excited about this new relationship and wanted everything to be perfect. She started insisting that we all act a certain way in front of her new boyfriend. She wanted us to be this picture-perfect family as if we'd all magically forget about Dad and his struggles. It was a lot of pressure. She'd constantly remind me to smile, to act happy, to be on my best behavior whenever her boyfriend was around. It felt like she was more concerned about making a good impression than actually dealing with the emotions we were all going through. I tried to go along with it for a while, but the facade was wearing thin. I was still grieving, and it felt like she was asking me to put on a mask and pretend everything was okay. One day, I finally snapped. I told her that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine and that her expectations were unrealistic given what we'd been through. I still had not forgiven her for how she treated my dad. Needed to be honest about my feelings and not have to hide them for the sake of appearances. Mom didn't take it well. She got really upset and told me I was being selfish and ungrateful. It was one of those moments where you realize that no matter how much you want to be understood, sometimes people just aren't ready or willing to listen. After that argument, things changed drastically. Mom started excluding me from family events and gatherings. It felt like she was punishing me for not playing along with the image she was trying to create. She'd still see me occasionally, but it was clear that our relationship was strained. It was like she had drawn a line in the sand, and I was on the wrong side of it. Things got even worse when I found out from my brother that Mom was engaged. It was a bit of a shock because I hadn't heard anything directly from her. We hadn't really been in touch much. Our conversations were sporadic and often awkward. I wasn't sure how to approach her, so I decided to reach out the best way I knew how. I sent her a congratulatory text. It was short and to the point. Hey Mom, I heard about your engagement. Congratulations. I hope you're happy. I figured that was a nice gesture, you know? Just trying to be supportive and bridge the gap, even though it felt like we were miles apart. But here's the kicker: she didn't respond. Not a word. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me felt hurt and confused, but I also knew that our relationship was rocky and maybe she was just dealing with her own stuff. I tried to brush it off, but it lingered in the back of my mind. Then my brother filled me in on something that completely knocked me for a loop. He told me that during the rehearsal dinner for Mom's wedding, she made a pretty big announcement. Apparently, she had talked about why I hadn't been invited to the wedding, and let me tell you, it was brutal. According to my brother, Mom had said in front of everyone, the reason my name isn't here is because she's problematic and mentally unstable like Dad, like daughter. Those words cut deep. I was already struggling with my feelings about the whole situation, and hearing that Mom had labeled me so harshly in front of her new family and friends was a gut punch. It felt like she was publicly distancing herself from me and using me as a scapegoat for her own choices. It was like she was trying to make me the villain in her story, and I couldn't help but feel crushed by it. It was hard to process the fact that she was using my mental health struggles as a reason to justify not including me in her life. It was like everything I had been through and the pain I had felt was being used against me. I felt invalidated and less important, like my own struggles were being twisted to make her look better or to fit a narrative she was trying to create. That's when I started hatching a plan. I'd always been a bit of a hothead when it came to dealing with my emotions, and in my mind, this was a chance to make a statement. I knew it wasn't healthy or productive, but at that moment, it felt like the only way to make myself heard. My idea was to show up at Mom's wedding reception and make a dramatic statement. Here's the thing: I had access to something that might make an impact. After Dad died, I'd been going through his old things, trying to sort through his belongings and find some sense of connection. Among his stuff, I found a collection of diaries. These weren't just random scribbles, they were detailed accounts of his life, his thoughts, and his struggles. I read through them, and it was eye-opening. Dad had written extensively about how Mom treated him poorly throughout their marriage, how she was critical and dismissive, and how it had affected him deeply. There were hundreds of pages detailing his emotional pain and the difficulties he faced. I wasn't sure what to do with these diaries at first. Part of me wanted to keep them as a way to remember Dad and honor his memory. But as I read through them and saw just how much he had endured, I felt this surge of anger. It seemed like an injustice that Mom was moving on so quickly and seemingly without any acknowledgement of the damage she had caused. I thought that maybe sharing some of Dad's own words might shed light on the reality of their relationship and make people see a different side of the story. So, I made the decision. I was going to crash Mom's wedding reception and make a statement. I knew it was drastic, but I felt like I needed to do something to be heard. I wanted to confront the public facade she had built and let people see what was really going on behind closed doors. The day of the wedding arrived, and I showed up at the venue. It was surreal walking into the reception hall, knowing that I was about to stir things up. I could see Mom and her new husband greeting guests, and everything looked like a scene straight out of a fairy tale. The decorations were beautiful, and everyone seemed to be having a great time. But for me, it was all just a mask for what I was about to reveal. I found a moment when there was a lull in the festivities. I waited until people were gathered around and the mood was a bit relaxed. Then I grabbed the microphone. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I was determined. I cleared my throat and said, "Excuse me, everyone. I know this is a joyous occasion, but I need to say a few words." The room fell silent, and I could feel the eyes on me. I took a deep breath and began reading excerpts from Dad's diaries. I chose parts where he talked about his struggles with Mom's behavior, and how he felt belittled and emotionally drained. I read about the harsh words she used, the demands she placed on him, and the deep emotional toll it had taken. It wasn't just about airing dirty laundry, it was about showing the reality behind the marriage. As I read, I could see the shock on people's faces. Some looked uncomfortable, others were visibly upset. Mom's face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. Her new husband looked bewildered, and I could see him trying to process what was happening. The room's atmosphere shifted from celebratory to tense and heavy. Mom eventually came up to the microphone and tried to stop me, but I wasn't done. I felt like I needed to finish what I started. I kept reading, trying to convey the depth of Dad's pain and how it had affected our family. I wanted people to understand that there was more to the story than what Mom had presented. After I finally finished, I handed the microphone back and walked out. I didn't stick around to see the aftermath. I knew I'd stirred up a lot of emotions, and I didn't want to be there for the fallout. I just needed to get away and process everything. In the days following, I was flooded with messages and calls. Some were from people who were sympathetic, others were from people who were angry or confused. Mom didn't reach out to me directly, but I heard through my brother and some mutual acquaintances that she was furious. She felt like I had completely disrespected her special day, and she was also deeply hurt by the public exposure of her past behavior. However, things were far from done. After the whole fiasco at Mom's wedding reception, I was mentally and emotionally drained. I felt like I'd made a mess of things, and I needed some space to figure out what to do next. So, I decided to block Mom's number and her social media accounts. I figured that if she needed to reach me, she'd find a way, but for now, I couldn't handle any more drama. A week went by, and I was trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy. I was deep into a new project at work and focusing on self-care. I wasn't expecting any news from Mom, if anything. I was bracing myself for a lot of anger and blame. So, it came as a shock when my brother called me one afternoon, sounding a bit frazzled. "Hey, I don't know if you've heard, but Mom's marriage ended," he said, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was telling me. I was stunned. "Wait, what? Mark left Mom? How?" My brother didn't have all the details, but from what he gathered, it was pretty sudden. Apparently, Mark had moved out just a few months into their marriage. My brother didn't know the exact reasons behind the split, but he mentioned hearing some vague things about disagreements and mounting tensions. From what I could piece together, it sounded like things fell apart quickly, which made me wonder if Mom's new relationship was as ideal as she'd made it out to be. "Do you know if Mom's okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned despite everything that had happened. My brother wasn't sure. He said Mom was putting on a brave face and trying to act like everything was fine, but he could tell she was struggling. It was clear that she was in a tough spot, and it made me think about how much pain she might be in right now. Even though I was still hurt by how she'd treated me, I didn't want to see her suffering. After the call, I sat there for a while, trying to process the news. Part of me felt a sense of vindication, like maybe this was some kind of cosmic payback for everything that had happened. But another part of me felt a pang of sympathy. It was clear that Mom was dealing with a lot, and as much as I'd been hurt by her actions, I knew what it was like to struggle with the fallout of failed relationships. I didn't reach out to Mom. It was a complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, I wanted to be there for her, but on the other hand, I didn't want to make things worse by bringing up old conflicts or reopening wounds. Plus, I wasn't sure how she'd react after everything that happened at the wedding. I was still blocked from her social media and didn't have her number unblocked yet. However, I didn't have to wonder for long. Last night she showed up at my door completely unannounced and in a state that was far from ideal. I was in the middle of watching a movie when I heard banging on my front door. It was late, and my first thought was that it must be a mistake or a prank. But the knocking continued, and it quickly turned into a loud, persistent banging. I opened the door, and there she was, Mom, stumbling around and clearly drunk out of her mind. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes were rumpled, and she reeked of alcohol. I could smell the booze from a good 5 feet away. She was making a scene in the hallway, shouting and sobbing, her words coming out in a slurry mess. "Why'd you do this to me? Why'd you have to ruin everything?" she yelled, her voice echoing through the hallway. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. It was a far cry from the composed persona she'd tried to project during her wedding and subsequent marriage. I knew I couldn't just leave her out there, not only because she was creating a disturbance but also because she looked like she needed help. I sighed and let her in, hoping she'd calm down once she was inside. I led her into the living room and tried to get her to sit down. "Mom, you need to calm down," I said, trying to keep my own frustration in check. "What's going on? Why are you so upset?" She ignored my questions and continued to rant, her accusations bouncing off the walls. "You ruined everything. I thought you were going to make things right, but all you did was make it worse. Mark left me because of you." The more she yelled, the more I realized how drunk she actually was. Her speech was incoherent, and she kept repeating the same phrases over and over. It was exhausting to listen to, but I tried to be patient. Despite everything that had happened, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was clearly in a lot of pain. Eventually, her yelling turned into a slow, muffled sobbing. Her energy seemed to drain, and she sank to the floor, curling up like a child. Within minutes, she was passed out cold, snoring loudly on my living room carpet. I looked at her lying there, feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me was angry at the way she'd come to my home and treated me, and angry at the whole situation in general. Another part of me felt pity. Seeing her like this, so vulnerable and broken, was a harsh reminder that she was human, too, and she was struggling in her own way. I decided it was best to just leave her where she was. I didn't have the emotional energy to deal with her right then. I grabbed a blanket from the closet and draped it over her, then went to my bedroom and shut the door. I needed to get some sleep myself, and I couldn't handle any more of the drama at that moment. The next morning, I woke up to find that Mom was still there, sleeping soundly on my floor. I could hear her faintly stirring as I made my way to the kitchen. I wasn't sure how to handle the situation. Part of me wanted to just let her wake up on her own and figure things out, but I also knew that ignoring her wasn't really an option. I made some coffee and tried to gather my thoughts. I had no idea how she'd react when she woke up, whether she'd be embarrassed, angry, or even apologetic. I just hoped that maybe, after sleeping off the alcohol, she'd be more open to having a real conversation. However, by the time I got back to the living room after making coffee, she had already left. The blanket was still there, crumpled on the floor, and the remnants of her outburst were evident in the scattered tissues and empty coffee cup. I felt a pang of guilt as I looked around at the mess she'd left behind. It was clear that she had been in a rough place, and seeing her like that made me question whether I had been too harsh with my dramatic entrance at her wedding reception. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. I replayed the scene at the reception over and over in my head, questioning if I had crossed a line. Was it really fair of me to expose her personal struggles in such a public way? Sure, I felt she needed to understand the impact of her actions, but was there a better way to handle it? I would love to hear your suggestions. Update 1. Hi guys. Some of you asked for what was in my dad's diary. I am not going to share everything, but here are a few excerpts. Here's what he wrote on March 12, 2005. She told me again that I'm weak and useless. She said she regrets ever marrying me. I don't know how much longer I can take this. June 18, 2007. She laughed at me when I told her about my anxiety attack. She said I'm just looking for attention. I feel so alone. And here's one from December 24, 2008. Christmas is supposed to be a happy time, but all she does is criticize me. She said I'm ruining the holidays for everyone. I just want to disappear. Reading these always breaks my heart. I hope that any one of you who is dealing with the same thing finds the strength to be better. Update 2. Hi guys. As per your suggestions, I did try reaching out to my mom, but she hasn't responded. It's been a few weeks since I sent her that letter, and I haven't heard a peep from her. I guess I shouldn't be too surprised given how things went down. I figured she might need some time and space. However, I did get some insight into what happened between my mom and Mark from my brother, and it's definitely adding another layer to this already complicated situation. So, my brother filled me in on some of the details about why Mark left Mom so abruptly. Apparently, Mark has a younger brother who has been battling depression for quite some time. It's a tough situation, and it's clear that Mark's family has had their share of struggles. According to my brother, just a couple of days after the wedding, Mark's brother somehow found out that Mom had been bad-mouthing him and making fun of his depression. Yeah, you heard that right. My mom apparently had a pretty cruel side that I hadn't seen before. Mark's brother had been struggling with his own mental health issues, and the fact that Mom was making fun of him behind his back was a big deal. It wasn't just idle gossip, she was apparently really harsh and dismissive about his struggles, which is obviously a big red flag for anyone who's sensitive about mental health. When my brother told me this, I felt a mix of shock and understanding. On one hand, it was appalling to hear that my mom could be so callous about something as serious as someone's mental health. On the other hand, it also kind of made sense why Mark would be so quick to end the marriage. If he found out that his new wife was being disrespectful and hurtful toward his own family, it's not exactly something you'd want to ignore. I was trying to make sense of all this when my brother suggested that we should try to find out more about Mark's brother and maybe reach out to him. He mentioned that it might be worth understanding how he was doing and if there was any way to make amends or at least offer an apology on Mom's behalf. It felt like a long shot, but I agreed that it might be a good idea to try and mend some of the bridges that had been burned. We managed to track down Mark's brother through some mutual connections, and after some careful consideration, I decided to reach out. I wanted to approach the situation delicately, knowing that he had every right to be angry and hurt. I sent him a message explaining who I was and acknowledging that I was aware of the situation. I apologized for what Mom had said and done, even though I wasn't directly responsible. I also expressed my hope that he was getting the support he needed and that I genuinely wished him well. To my surprise, he responded. He was understandably cautious but appreciated the gesture. We had a few exchanges where he explained a bit more about how he was coping and how he had felt hurt by Mom's comments. He also mentioned that he was in therapy and working on his mental health, which was a relief to hear. It was a small step toward making things right, and while I knew it wouldn't fix everything, it felt like a start. Update 3. Hi everyone. I know it's only been a few days since my last update, but things have taken some more twists and turns. So, here's the latest. My brother has been trying really hard to reach out to mom, hoping to patch things up or at least get some clarity on where things stand. Unfortunately, things haven't gone as smoothly as we'd hoped. A few days ago, my brother decided to make another attempt to see mom. He thought maybe some time had passed, and she might be more open to talking things through. He showed up at her place, hoping to have a calm conversation and maybe start rebuilding some bridges. But when he arrived, she refused to even let him in. She slammed the door in his face, and from what he described, it was pretty harsh. It felt like a punch in the gut, especially since he was only trying to be there for her and figure out a way forward. That wasn't the end of it, though. A couple of days later, my brother tried to check in again, thinking that maybe things had cooled down a bit. He knocked on her door and tried calling her, but she wasn't answering. It was really unlike her to be so unreachable, especially considering she's usually pretty responsive. After a lot of calls and searching, he eventually discovered that mom had left town to visit her sister. Mom had apparently told my brother to stop bothering her and to leave her alone. She made it clear that she didn't want to talk to him or, by extension, to anyone from our side of the family. It was a tough blow, and I felt a pang of sympathy for my brother. He was just trying to reach out and maybe mend things, but it seemed like mom was shutting everyone out entirely. Hearing this news left me feeling conflicted. On one hand, I understood that mom was probably overwhelmed and struggling with her own emotions. It must be incredibly hard for her to face everything that's happened and to deal with the fallout of her actions. On the other hand, it was frustrating and disheartening to see her isolating herself and refusing to address the issues. It felt like she was avoiding the very conversations that needed to happen for any kind of healing to occur. My brother and I talked about it, and he shared how disheartened he felt. He genuinely wanted to help and offer support, but mom's refusal to engage made him feel like his efforts were in vain. It's hard when you're trying to reach out to someone and they just push you away. He mentioned that he was considering giving her more space for now, hoping that maybe she'd come around when she was ready. But it's a tough call, and he's unsure of the best approach. Thanks for reading and for all the support and advice you've given so far. I am grateful for it.